They worshipped him. That was the part no one ever talked about honestly. Not the fear, not the iron-fisted governance or the rebellions ground to dust beneath political machinery so precise it made other rulers look like children playing with their father's crowns. No. The terrifying part about Duke Cydric Valamont was that an entire kingdom genuinely believed he was something more than human. And on the storm-wrecked morning, when a single piece of paper proved otherwise, every soul in Valadorn learned a truth far more dangerous than any conspiracy. The most powerful man alive had been bleeding in silence for 20 years. What happened next will stay with you long after the last word fades. The ceremony had been planned for months. The Grand Hall of Aurelius in the capital city of Arctur seated over 600, and every seat was filled 40 minutes before the Duke was scheduled to arrive. The hall itself was a monument to Valamont excess. Black marble pillars rising 60 feet to a vaulted ceiling inlaid with gold leaf that caught the candlelight and threw it back in patterns designed to make people feel small. Oil portraits of dead rulers lined the walls in chronological order, each face painted with the same flat expression of controlled superiority that had become the unofficial mask of the bloodline. The occasion was the 20th anniversary of Duke Octavian Valamont's death. A state commemoration. A public performance disguised as remembrance. Every noble house in Valadorn sent representatives. Generals wore full dress uniforms. Diplomats arrived with their wives draped in jewels heavy enough to double as weapons. Journalists from 4 provinces filled the press gallery with sharpened pencils and notebooks already half full of predetermined adjectives. And at the center of it all, standing behind a podium constructed from the same obsidian stone as his father's mausoleum, Duke Cydric Valamont prepared to deliver a speech honoring the legacy of the man who had built the modern empire. Cydric was 36 years old and looked exactly like what power shapes a man into when it starts working on him before he is old enough to resist. Tall, lean in the way of men who replace meals with strategy sessions. Dark hair cut close to the skull, jaw angled like something designed by an architect more interested in intimidation than beauty. His uniform was midnight blue with silver stitching along the collar. No medals, no ribbons, because Cydric had long ago understood that a man who needs decoration is a man still begging for approval. His hands rested atop the Valamont Chronicle, the family's ceremonial ledger containing 3 centuries of recorded lineage, military victories, and political alliances. He touched it the same way every Sunday during public proceedings. Same angle, same pressure, same carefully cultivated impression of a man whose roots ran deeper than anyone else's. The hall waited. Cydric opened the chronicle to the page marked with his father's death record and began to speak. 20 years ago, this kingdom lost the architect of its modern strength. Duke Octavian Valamont did not govern through sentiment. He governed through clarity, through the understanding that a nation survives not by the warmth of its leaders, but by the precision of their decisions. His voice filled the hall without effort, low, controlled, a voice built for rooms that were designed to make ordinary men feel insignificant. Today, we honor that clarity. We honor the man who crushed the Thessaran revolt before it could bleed into civil war, who restructured our military command during the southern border crisis, who understood that legacy is not built by being loved. It is built by being necessary. Applause rippled through the chamber, measured, respectful, the kind of applause that happens when people are performing agreement rather than feeling it. Cydric turned the page, and something fell. One sheet. Cream-colored paper folded into thirds, the edges softened by years of handling, worn translucent at the creases where fingers had opened and refolded it hundreds of times. It drifted from between the pages of the chronicle and landed on the black marble floor with a sound so small it should have been swallowed by the acoustics of the room. But silence has its own architecture, and 600 people watching the most controlled man in Valadorn simultaneously stopped breathing. The paper landed face up. A young state herald standing beside the podium bent automatically to retrieve it. His training was impeccable. He had spent 4 years learning to anticipate the needs of powerful men and react before conscious thought could interfere. He picked up the letter, glanced down to identify it so he could return it with appropriate discretion, and then every rehearsed instinct in his body failed him at once. He froze. His face shifted from professional blankness to something raw and confused and frightened in the span of a single heartbeat. The first 3 rows of nobles saw it happen. Their attention moved from Caedric to the herald, then to the letter, then back to Caedric. Caedric's expression changed. Not much. To anyone who did not know him, it might have looked like nothing at all, a slight tightening around the eyes. The jaw locking half a degree tighter than usual, fingers that had been resting on the chronicle pulling back as if the book had suddenly become hot. But Seraphine saw it. Duchess Seraphine Valamont sat in the front row wearing emerald silk and a diamond collar that caught the light every time she breathed. She had been married to Caedric for 11 years. She knew the geography of his control the way cartographers knew coastlines. She could map every calculated expression, every engineered silence, every microscopic adjustment he made when the world pressed against the walls he had built around himself. And she had never, in 11 years, seen fear cross his face. Until now. The herald's voice cracked, not intentionally, not as performance. His eyes had landed on the opening line of the letter, and his training collapsed under the weight of what he read. "My dearest Caedric," he said aloud, and then caught himself. But it was already too late. "If they ever force you to hate me, remember that I loved you before the Empire ever did." The signature at the bottom was visible from 6 feet away. Elara Vane. The silence in the grand hall became something physical, something with weight and texture, and the particular density of 600 people understanding simultaneously that the world they lived in had just cracked down the center. Elara Vane had been dead for 20 years, executed publicly on charges of treason against House Valamont, condemned as an enemy of the state who had attempted to destabilize the duchy through revolutionary agitation and conspiracy against the ruling bloodline. Caedric himself had referenced her execution in speeches, had used her name as shorthand for the kind of betrayal that justified every harsh measure his family had ever imposed. And now a love letter from that same woman had fallen from his personal chronicle, in front of the entire empire. Caedric did not move for 7 seconds, Seraphine counted. 7 seconds of absolute stillness, while 600 pairs of eyes burned into him, and the herald stood frozen with the letter trembling in his fingers. Then the Duke stepped forward, took the letter from the herald's hand with surgical precision, folded it, and placed it inside his coat. "The ceremony is concluded," he said. His voice had not changed, not in volume, not in tone, not in any measurable way. But something behind it had shifted. Some load-bearing wall inside his composure had developed a fracture that would never fully heal. He walked out of the grand hall without looking at anyone. The doors closed behind him, and Arctur exploded. By midnight, the letter had been reconstructed from the herald's stammered account and distributed through every noble house in the capital. By dawn, copies appeared in broadsheets. By the following afternoon, artists who had never seen Elara Vane's face were painting portraits based on 20-year-old descriptions pulled from trial records. The story wrote itself faster than anyone could contain it. The Duke of Valadorn, the Empire's most ruthless political machine, had been secretly in love with the woman his own family had executed for treason. The implications detonated like ordnance across the political landscape. If Caedric had loved Elara, had he believed in her treason? Had he participated in her condemnation willingly? Had the execution been just, or had it been something far uglier? And if the most powerful man in Valadorn had been lying about this for 20 years, what else had he buried? Seraphine did not sleep that night. She sat in her private chambers on the 4th floor of Blackthorn Castle, while rain hammered the windows and thunder rolled across the northern highlands like artillery fire. A glass of wine sat untouched on the table beside her. She did not need wine, she needed answers. At 2 a.m, she went looking for them. Caedric's private study occupied the east wing of the castle, separated from the rest of the residence by a corridor lined with maps of territories he had conquered or absorbed through political maneuvering over the past decade. The door was locked. She had a key. He did not know she had a key. There are things wives learn about their husbands that have nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. The study was empty. Caedric was elsewhere. Probably the war chamber. Probably surrounded by advisors trying to calculate the political damage of a single piece of paper falling at the wrong moment. Seraphine moved to the far wall where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held military treatises, political histories, and economic reports arranged with the obsessive precision that defined everything Caedric touched. She ran her fingers along the spines until she found the seam, a false panel carved into the wall behind the third shelf from the left. She had discovered it accidentally 2 years earlier while searching for a misplaced treaty document. She had opened it, seen what was inside, and closed it without touching anything. Because 2 years ago, she had not been ready to understand what the contents meant. Tonight, she was. The panel opened on a spring mechanism. Behind it, a cavity roughly the size of a bread box contained 27 letters bundled together with black ribbon. Some were stained by rain. Others bore fingerprints darkened by age, pressed into the margins by someone who had held them repeatedly over many years. All written in the same feminine hand. All signed by Alara Vane. Seraphine carried them to the fireplace and sat in Kaedric's chair and read them one by one, while lightning cracked against the castle walls and the storm made the old stone building groan like something alive and in pain. The first letter was dated 22 years ago. You taught me mercy when your father taught you conquest. I do not know which lesson will survive, but I know which one deserves to. The fourth letter described a meeting in the lower gardens of the old Valamon estate after midnight. 2 people sitting on a stone bench while guards patrolled 30 feet away. The specificity was devastating. The angle of moonlight, the temperature of the air, the way his hands shook when he touched her face for the first time. I keep thinking about your hands, not because they were gentle, but because they were terrified. You touched me like I was something that would disappear if you held on too hard. Nobody who governs the way your father does has hands that shake like that. You are not him, Kaedric. You are not him yet. Please do not become him. The 7th letter was a response in Kaedric's handwriting. Seraphine recognized it immediately. The sharp downstrokes, the aggressive slant to the right, the way he formed his capital letters like small acts of violence against the page. I would burn every alliance in Valadorn before I let them touch you again. Tell me that makes me weak. Tell me that makes me a fool. I need to hear it from someone who will not lie to me. The 15th letter was shorter, written in a hand that trembled. They are watching us. Your father's men followed me to the archive yesterday. I burned everything I could reach, but there are records I cannot destroy without being seen. If this reaches you, meet me at the usual place. If it does not, then know that I loved you in the only way I know how. Completely, recklessly, without any of the calculation that your family considers strength. Seraphine read all the 27 letters in order. Then she sat in silence for a long time. The fire burned low and the storm outside quieted to a steady rain, and the castle settled into the particular stillness that comes at 3 a.m. when even stone buildings seem to understand that something has changed permanently. 11 years of marriage, 11 years of political partnership, shared public appearances, coordinated social strategies, and the careful, respectful distance that characterized their relationship. Kaedric had never been cruel to her. He had been courteous, reliable, occasionally even warm in the private moments that occurred between state functions. But he had never once touched her the way those letters described him touching Alara Vane. She had always assumed his emotional restraint was constitutional, built into his character the way coldness was built into northern winters, something you adapted to, something you stopped questioning because the alternative was too uncomfortable. Now she understood. He was not constitutionally cold. He was empty. The parts of him capable of genuine connection had been given to someone else 20 years ago, and when that someone was taken from him, those parts did not return. They died with her. What remained was architecture without foundation. A man who could govern empires but could not feel anything beyond the operational minimum required to keep functioning. Their marriage had never been loveless. It had been something worse. It had been a performance by a man who no longer had the capacity to perform anything real. Seraphine found Kaedric at dawn in the war chamber beneath Blackthorn Castle. The chamber was exactly what its name suggested. A room designed for conflict. Maps covered 3 walls, military markers tracking troop positions along the southern borders where minor uprisings flared periodically, like infections that refused to fully heal. A long table dominated the center, scarred by decades of commanders slamming fists during arguments about strategy. The room smelled like old stone and candle wax, and the particular staleness that accumulates in underground spaces where daylight never reaches. Kaedric stood at the far end of the table studying a map of the capital with the focused intensity of a man who had not slept. His coat was removed. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm. A glass of whiskey sat half-finished beside his right hand. He looked up when Seraphine entered but did not speak. She closed the door behind her. "I read the letters," she said. No preamble. No diplomatic framing. She had spent 11 years speaking to this man through layers of political courtesy and strategic ambiguity, and tonight she did not have the energy for any of it. Kaedric's hand tightened around the whiskey glass. A small movement, almost invisible. But Seraphine had spent a decade learning to read him through his hands because his face gave nothing. "All of them?" he asked. "All 27. He lifted the glass, drank, set it down. "Then you know. I know that you loved a woman the Empire condemned as a traitor. I know that you kept her letters hidden in your study for 20 years while publicly using her name as a symbol of everything House Valamont stood against. And I know that a single piece of paper falling at the wrong moment has done more damage to this family than any military threat in a decade." She paused. "What I do not know is whether you are going to survive it." "The political fallout is manageable," he said, but his voice lacked the titanium certainty she was accustomed to hearing. "Hargrove is already drafting containment strategies. We discredit the letter, challenge its authenticity. The Herald will be reassigned. The journalists can be pressured through their publishers." "I'm not talking about the politics, Kaedric." He looked at her then, really looked. And for the second time in 24 hours, Seraphine saw something behind his eyes that she had never encountered in their marriage. Not the fear she had glimpsed in the grand hall, something deeper, exhaustion. The specific bone-deep weariness of a man who has been carrying something for so long that the weight has become indistinguishable from his own skeleton, who cannot remember what his body felt like before the burden, because the burden started before he was finished becoming a person. "What do you want me to say?" he asked quietly. "I want you to tell me the truth, not the version you have rehearsed for advisors, not the political calculation. The truth. The truth." He almost smiled, almost. The expression died before it reached his mouth, stillborn, like a reflex his face had forgotten how to complete. "The truth is that I have spent 20 years building everything you see around us on top of a lie so fundamental that removing it would collapse the entire structure. And yesterday a piece of paper did what 20 years of enemies could not." "Did you love her?" The question landed in the underground chamber like a physical object. Heavy, sharp-edged, impossible to step around. Kaedric was silent for a long time. Long enough that the candles on the table burned down a visible fraction, and the shadows in the room shifted and reorganized themselves around the two figures standing on opposite sides of the war table. "Yes," he said finally. One word, no qualification, no political framing, just the admission of a man who had spent 2 decades pretending a fundamental part of himself did not exist and could not sustain the pretense for one more second. Seraphine absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, with the precise analytical composure that had made her an effective duchess and an invaluable political partner. But underneath that composure, something cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the quiet fracture of a woman realizing that the marriage she had invested 11 years of her life in had been a structure built on the wrong foundation from the very beginning. "And the execution," she said carefully. "Did you believe she was guilty?" Kaedric's jaw tightened. The muscles along his neck corded visibly. His hand found the whiskey glass again, lifted it, then set it down without drinking, as if the gesture itself had become meaningless. "My father told me she was," he said. "And I chose to believe him, because believing him meant inheriting the empire, and questioning him meant losing everything." "That is not an answer." "No." He met her eyes. "It is not." The silence between them stretched until it became its own kind of communication. Two people standing in an underground room surrounded by maps of territories they controlled, recognizing simultaneously that the most dangerous territory in Valadorn was the space between them. "Your father fabricated the charges," Seraphine said. It was not a question. She had read the letters. She understood the pattern. Octavian Valamon had been a man who solved problems by eliminating them. An heir who loved a revolutionary was a problem. I do not know that, Kedrick said. You suspect it. I have suspected it for 15 years. And you did nothing. What would you have had me do? The question carried no anger, no defensiveness, just the hollow weight of a man who had asked himself the same thing every day for 15 years and never found an answer that did not destroy him. Investigate my own father? Reopen a treason case that the entire empire accepted as closed? Tear apart the foundation of a dynasty that 3 million people depend on for stability? For what? For a woman who is already dead? For the truth. The truth. He said the word like it tasted bitter. The truth does not rebuild what it destroys. I learned that from my father. He told me once that the difference between a ruler and a man is that a ruler understands what certain truths cost. And he was right. He was right about that one thing, and I have hated him for it every day since. Seraphine crossed the room slowly. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes that had not been there when they married, close enough to see that his hands were not steady, close enough to see that the man she had lived beside for 11 years was standing in front of her without a single defense left, stripped bare by 24 hours and a piece of cream-colored paper. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Kedrick looked at the maps on the wall, the military markers, the carefully plotted positions of allies and enemies arranged across a landscape he had spent his adult life controlling. "There are records," he said slowly, "in the archive beneath the East Wing, my father's personal files. I sealed them after his death. I told myself it was for security, for preservation." He paused. "But I sealed them because I was afraid of what they contained. And now? Now a letter has fallen from a book in front of 600 people, and the Empire is asking questions I have spent 20 years avoiding. So either I open those archives and face whatever my father buried in them, or I spend the rest of my life defending a legacy I am no longer certain deserves defending." Seraphine studied him for a long moment. Then she did something she had never done in 11 years of marriage. She placed her hand on his arm, not as a wife, not as a political partner, not as the Duchess performing the role the Empire expected of her, as one human being reaching across a distance toward another human being who was drowning. "Then open them," she said. Kedrick looked at her hand on his arm as if he did not understand the gesture, as if physical contact initiated outside the boundaries of public performance was a language he had forgotten how to interpret. Then he nodded once. They descended into the East Wing archive together as the first gray light of dawn crept through the castle windows. The staircase was narrow, unlit, carved into stone that predated the current structure by 2 centuries. Kedrick carried a lantern. Seraphine walked behind him. Neither spoke. The archive was a vault. Iron door. Double locked. The air inside was cold and still and smelled like old paper and dust, and the particular absence of life that accumulates in rooms where secrets are stored for decades. Kedrick set the lantern on a stone ledge and began opening boxes. What they found took 3 hours to read. Trial transcripts, witness testimonies, military intelligence reports, personal correspondence between Octavian Valamont and his chief of intelligence, a man named Harlan Goss, who had died conveniently in a riding accident 6 months after Alara's execution. The documents told a story that was worse than Seraphine had anticipated, not just a fabricated treason charge, a coordinated political assassination disguised as justice, manufactured evidence, coerced witnesses, military resources diverted to create the appearance of a revolutionary conspiracy that had never existed. Alara Vane had not been a traitor. She had been a problem. And Octavian Valamont solved problems the way empires have always solved problems, by making them disappear and rewriting the record. Kedrick read the final document, a personal memo from his father to Harlan Goss dated 3 days before the execution, and then he set it down on the stone table and did not move for a very long time. Seraphine watched him from across the vault. She had expected rage, expected the explosive, controlled fury that Kedrick deployed when military operations failed or political alliances fractured. The kind of anger that destroyed things efficiently because efficiency was the only emotional register the Valamont bloodline trusted. Instead, she watched something far more disturbing. She watched him go still. Not the calculated stillness of a man collecting himself. The absolute structural stillness of a man whose internal architecture was collapsing floor by floor while the exterior held its shape through nothing but the residual tension of materials that had not yet received the message that the foundation was gone. "He killed her," Kadric said. His voice was flat, stripped of inflection, the voice of someone reporting a fact about a stranger rather than confronting the central catastrophe of his own existence. "He manufactured the charges. He fabricated the evidence. He had her condemned and executed because she was inconvenient, because I loved her, because love was a variable he could not control, and my father could not tolerate variables he could not control. Kadric. And I let him." The flatness cracked, not into volume, into something quieter and infinitely more frightening, a whisper that carried the weight of 2 decades of complicity. I stood in the crowd. I watched them take her. She looked for me. She searched the faces, and she found mine, and I saw her understand that I was not going to save her, and I did nothing. Because he told me it was necessary, because he told me that this was what power required, and I believed him because believing him was easier than being the man she thought I was. Seraphine felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of everything. This was not a political crisis. This was a man discovering, at 36, that the foundation of his entire existence was a murder disguised as governance. That his father had not built an empire on strength and clarity, but on the systematic elimination of anything that threatened his control, including his own son's capacity to love. And Kadric had inherited all of it, had continued it, had refined his father's methods and expanded his territories and polished the machinery of power until it gleamed, never understanding that the engine at the center of it all was running on blood that should never have been spilled. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form the words, footsteps echoed down the stone staircase. Hard, fast, military cadence. Captain Aldrich Thorne appeared in the vault doorway, his face drawn tight with the particular expression that career soldiers develop when the news they carry is worse than anything they have been trained to deliver. "Your Grace," he said, breathing hard, "you need to come upstairs." "Not now," Kadric said without turning. "Sir, it cannot wait." Something in Thorne's voice cut through the fog. Kadric looked up. 3 hours ago, the Royal Council convened an emergency session in the capital, Thorne said. Lord Chancellor Hargrove attempted to contain the situation as instructed. He failed. The opposition bloc introduced a formal motion before dawn. What motion? Thorne swallowed. They are calling for a full tribunal investigation into House Valamont. 20 years of governance under review. Every military order, every political execution, every territorial acquisition since your father's rule. He paused. And the king has endorsed it. The lantern flame guttered in a draft that came from nowhere. Kadric stood in the archive vault surrounded by the evidence of his father's crimes, while above him, the empire he had spent his entire life serving prepared to devour the dynasty that had built it. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, Seraphine realized that the man standing in front of her was no longer deciding whether to fight or surrender. He was deciding whether the empire his father built deserved to survive at all. Captain Thorne waited in the doorway like a man who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether he still had a career by morning. His boots were mud-splattered from a hard ride across the castle grounds, and his breathing had not fully settled, which meant he had run the last stretch from the stables to the archive staircase on foot. Kadric did not move immediately. He stood in the vault surrounded by his father's documents with one hand still resting on the final memo, the one addressed to Harlan Goss, the one that contained the words, "Ensure the Vane matter is resolved permanently before the autumn session," and he processed Thorne's report the way a structural engineer processes the sound of a crack in a load-bearing wall. Not with panic, with calculation, with the rapid instinctive assessment of how much time remains before the entire structure comes down. Who introduced the motion? Kadric asked. Lord Aldrin Cassavane, seconded by Lady Margot Thoreau and the Count of Versailles. Cassavane, Kadric repeated the name without inflection. But Seraphine, watching from the far side of the vault, saw something shift behind his eyes. Aldrin Cassavane had been Octavian Valamont's closest political ally for 15 years. He had attended every state function, shared every strategic council, endorsed every military action the old Duke had ordered, including the execution of Ilara Vane. If Cassavane was leading the investigation, he was not pursuing justice. He was burying evidence. Cadric understood this faster than Seraphine did. "He is not investigating my family," Cadric said quietly. "He is controlling the narrative. If Cassavane chairs the tribunal, he decides what gets examined and what gets sealed. He decides which documents surface and which disappear. Your Grace, the council session is scheduled for 4 days from now. If you intend to respond formally, Hargrove needs directives before noon. Tell Hargrove to do nothing." Thorn blinked. In 12 years of service, he had never heard those words from Cadric Valamont. "Nothing, sir?" "Nothing. No statements, no legal motions, no contact with the press. I want silence from every member of this household until I decide how we move. The opposition will interpret silence as weakness. Let them." Thorn looked at Seraphine as if hoping the Duchess might intervene with something rational. She did not. She was watching Cadric with the focused attention of someone who had just realized that the man she married was no longer operating inside the framework she understood. Thorn saluted and left. The sound of his boots receding up the stone staircase faded into the underground silence. The lantern flame steadied. The vault returned to its natural state of cold, still, airless preservation. Seraphine spoke first. "You cannot do nothing." "I am not doing nothing." Cadric began gathering the documents from the table. His movements were precise, methodical, the hands of a man sorting ammunition rather than paper. "I am choosing which war to fight. There is a difference. The tribunal will subpoena your records within the week, your father's files, your military correspondence, everything in this vault." "I know." "Then you understand that silence gives Cassavane time to prepare, to build his case, to position himself as the righteous inquisitor while you stand accused. Cassavane is not building a case against me." Cadric stopped, held up one of the documents. A military requisition order signed by Octavian, countersigned by Cassavane himself, authorizing the deployment of soldiers to arrest Ilara Vane based on intelligence that the document described as confirmed through independent verification, intelligence that, according to the Goss memo, had been entirely fabricated. "He is building a case against my father, a dead man who cannot defend himself, so that when the tribunal concludes, House Valamont absorbs the blame, Cassavane walks away clean, and every noble family that participated in Octavian's governance spends the next century pretending they had no idea what was happening. And if you expose them," Cadric looked at her, "if I expose them, I burn down the entire aristocratic structure of Valadorn, every house that endorsed my father's orders, every general who carried them out, every diplomat who looked the other way. The Empire does not survive that kind of reckoning, Seraphine. Not intact. So you protect them. I protect the stability of 3 million people who depend on a system that functions regardless of how corrupt its origins are. That is your father talking." The sentence hit him like a slap. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. Seraphine saw the impact travel through his body, the slight flinch in his shoulders, the way his hands stopped moving for one fraction of a second before resuming their mechanical sorting. "Maybe," he said, "but my father kept this empire standing for 30 years. By murdering innocent people. By making decisions that no one else had the stomach to make. That is what governance is. That is what this room was built for. Not justice, not truth, decision." Seraphine crossed the vault and stood directly in front of him, close enough that the lantern light caught the sharp angles of her face and threw shadows beneath her cheekbones that made her look older than 32. Harder. More dangerous. "I read 27 letters last night," she said. "And in those letters, I found a man I have never met. A man who wrote about mercy, about burning thrones rather than hurting someone he loved, about weakness being more honest than power." She held his gaze. "Where is that man, Cadric? Because the person standing in front of me right now sounds exactly like the father who destroyed him." Cadric's breathing changed, a shallow adjustment, the kind of respiratory shift that happens when someone absorbs a blow to the sternum and does not want anyone to see the impact. He did not answer. He picked up the documents, placed them inside a leather case, extinguished the lantern, and walked past her up the staircase without another word. Seraphine stood alone in the dark vault for a long time. Then she followed. The next 72 hours reshaped the political geography of Valadorn more thoroughly than any military campaign in the past 2 decades. Casavane moved fast. By the following morning, he had secured endorsements from 11 noble houses supporting the tribunal investigation. Public statements appeared in every major broadsheet, carefully worded, strategically outraged. The language of men who had been complicit in everything they now condemned and understood that the fastest way to avoid accountability was to be the first to point fingers. Hargrove, Caedric's chief political advisor, arrived at Blackthorn Castle at dawn and spent 4 hours in the war chamber waiting for directives that never came. Because Caedric was not in the war chamber, he was in his study, alone, reading the letters. Seraphine discovered this when she went looking for him after receiving a dispatch from her own intelligence network, a small, discreet operation she had built independently over the past 8 years without Caedric's knowledge or permission. She maintained contacts among servants in rival households, minor officials in the royal bureaucracy, and 2 journalists who owed her favors she had never collected. The network was modest, but it was hers, and right now it was telling her things that Caedric's official channels were not. She found him in the chair by the window. The letters spread across his desk in chronological order, a glass of whiskey untouched beside them. The morning light falling across the pages illuminated the faded ink and the fingerprints and the places where water or tears had warped the paper decades ago. He was reading the 11th letter. She could tell by the position of his hands on the page. "Hargrove has been waiting since 6, she said from the doorway. "I know. The Thessarin garrison sent a request for reinforcement orders yesterday, southern border activity. You have not responded." "I know. Lord Devereux is hosting a gathering tonight at his estate. 12 noble families. The official purpose is a hunting party. The actual purpose is to determine whether House Valamont can be stripped of its northern territories without triggering a military response." Caedric looked up from the letter. His eyes were bloodshot. Not from drinking, from not sleeping, from spending the hours that should have been devoted to political survival, instead sitting in a chair reading words written by a woman who had been dead for 20 years, searching through sentences for some trace of the person he had been before his father's ambition had ground him into the shape required by dynasty. "Devereux is positioning himself as a successor," Seraphine continued. "If the tribunal removes you from governance, someone fills the vacuum. Casavane controls the political machinery, Devereux controls the military contracts. Between them, they carve up everything your family spent 3 centuries building." "You have been busy," Caedric said. "One of us needed to be." The sharpness in her voice surprised both of them. Seraphine was not a woman who lost control of her tone. She had been trained from childhood to modulate every word, every inflection, every silence for maximum strategic effect. The fact that anger had leaked through her composure told Caedric more about the severity of their situation than any intelligence report could have. He set down the letter. "What do you want me to do, Seraphine?" "I want you to stop reading dead letters and start governing. I want you to go downstairs and give Hargrove something to work with before Casavane finishes building the cage he is constructing around this family. I want you to remember that whatever you owed that woman, whatever guilt you carry, the Empire will not pause its destruction of House Valamont to give you time to grieve. She was not a traitor. I know she was not a traitor. I read the evidence. But the tribunal does not care whether she was a traitor. The tribunal cares about power, about who holds it and who takes it when the current holder stumbles. And right now you are stumbling, Caedric. You are stumbling, and every predator in Valadorn can smell it." He stood, moved to the window, looked out over the castle grounds where groundskeepers continued their routines as if the political structure of the empire were not disintegrating above their heads. Men trimming hedges, horses being exercised in the lower paddock, the mundane machinery of daily life operating in complete indifference to the catastrophe unfolding in the rooms above. "My father killed an innocent woman to keep me under control," Caedric said without turning. "He manufactured evidence, coerced witnesses, used the full apparatus of the state to eliminate a 22-year-old woman whose only crime was making his son feel something he could not regulate. And then he handed me the empire and told me it was my inheritance, my responsibility, my purpose." He pressed one hand flat against the glass. The same gesture Seraphine had seen him make 1,000 times. A man touching a barrier, testing its solidity, measuring the distance between himself and the outside world. I have spent 20 years running this machinery, maintaining it, improving it, telling myself that the cost was justified because the result was stability, order. 3 million people fed and governed and protected by a system that works, whatever its origins. He paused. And now I am standing in my study reading letters from the woman my father murdered, and I cannot remember why any of it was supposed to matter more than she did. Because it does matter, Seraphine said. Her voice had changed. The anger was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Something she did not want to name because naming it would complicate the clean, strategic framework through which she had always navigated their relationship. 3 million people did not choose your father's crimes. They did not choose this dynasty. They were born into it, the same way you were. And if you collapse now, if you let Cassavane and Devereaux dismantle this house, those people do not get justice. They get new masters. Worse masters. Masters who participated in every crime your father committed and learned nothing from any of it except how to avoid getting caught. Kedrick turned from the window. For a moment, standing in the morning light with exhaustion carved into every line of his face, he looked like neither the feared Duke nor the broken man who read love letters at 3 a.m. He looked like something in between, something unfinished. A person caught in the exact middle point between who his father had built and who Alara had believed he could become, unable to reach either shore. You're right, he said. I know I am right. You are also asking me to save an empire built on the murder of the woman I loved. I am asking you to decide what kind of ruin you prefer, because ruin is coming either way. The only question is whether you choose the shape of it or whether Cassavane chooses it for you. Kedrick held her gaze for a long time. Then he rolled down his sleeves, fastened his cuffs, and walked toward the door with a stride that carried the mechanical precision of a man who has decided to function regardless of whether the decision feels survivable. Tell Hargrove I will be in the war chamber in 10 minutes, he said, and send word to Devereaux that I will attend his gathering tonight. Kedrick, he stopped. If you go to Devereaux's estate, you go as the Duke, not as a man asking for mercy, not as a man carrying guilt. You go as the most dangerous person in that room, or you do not go at all. Something flickered across his face. The ghost of the man who had once written, "Let the Empire choke on my weakness," in a letter to a woman he would never see again. I have been the most dangerous person in every room I have entered since I was 23 years old, he said quietly. That has never been the problem. Then what is? He looked at her, and the answer sat between them unspoken but perfectly understood by both. The problem was not whether he could be dangerous. The problem was that being dangerous was the only thing his father had ever taught him to be, and for 20 years that had been enough, and now it was not, and he did not know what came after. He left. Seraphine stood in the study surrounded by 27 letters and the fading smell of whiskey and forced herself to think clearly about what came next. She was not a woman who indulged in emotional complexity when strategic clarity was available. She had married Kedrick Valamon, understanding exactly what the arrangement was. Political partnership, territorial consolidation, the merger of two powerful houses into an alliance that benefited both families. Love had never been part of the contract, and she had not wasted energy mourning its absence because mourning implied expectation, and Seraphine did not carry expectations she could not enforce. But the letters had introduced a variable she could not account for, not jealousy. She had examined that possibility during the night and dismissed it. You cannot be jealous of a dead woman. You can only be disturbed by the realization that the man you married had a capacity for depth that you never received, not because you were insufficient, but because that capacity had been amputated, cut away by trauma, and buried under 20 years of compensatory performance. What disturbed her was simpler and more dangerous than jealousy. Pity. She pitied him. And pity, in the world she inhabited, was the most destabilizing emotion available to a person with power. Devereaux's estate occupied 1,200 acres of rolling parkland 40 minutes north of Arctur. The house itself was a monument to inherited wealth, cream-colored stone with columns thick enough to double as fortifications, lit by 300 candles that turned the facade into something that looked more like a statement of intent than a residence. Kedrick arrived at 9 in the evening, alone. No advisors, no guards beyond the standard driver. Seraphine had argued against this. Hargrove had argued against this. Thorne had physically stood in front of the carriage door for 8 seconds before military discipline overrode personal objection, and he stepped aside. Kedrick walked into Devereaux's drawing room the way he walked into every room, like he owned the architecture and was merely permitting other people to occupy space within it. The posture was so practiced it had become involuntary, his body defaulting to dominance the way a soldier's body defaults to readiness. Not because he chose it in the moment, but because he had been conditioned beyond the point where the behavior required conscious activation. 12 noble families, 43 people in the room, crystal glasses, a string quartet playing something forgettable in the corner, the smell of expensive tobacco and perfume, and the particular chemical tension that accumulates when powerful people gather to discuss the destruction of one of their own while pretending to discuss horses. Lord Devereux intercepted him immediately. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, because his eyes were always calculating the cost of whatever his mouth was committing to. "Your Grace, I was not certain you would come. I never miss an opportunity to see who is sharpening their knives." Devereux's smile tightened by 1 degree. "Always direct. I have always admired that about your family. My family is the reason you are hosting this gathering, Devereux. Let us not pretend otherwise." The drawing room heard it. All 43 people heard it. Conversations did not stop exactly. They thinned, reduced in volume and density as attention redirected toward the 2 men standing near the entrance with crystal glasses they had not yet touched, and expressions that belonged in a war chamber rather than a social function. "The tribunal concerns all of us," Devereux said carefully. "Your father's legacy is part of our collective history. Whatever the investigation reveals, it reflects on every house that served under his governance." "It does, which is why I find it interesting that Cassavane introduced the motion rather than opposing it. Aldrin believes in transparency. Aldrin believes in survival. There is a difference." Devereux studied him. The calculation behind his eyes became visible for a fraction of a second, like a card player accidentally revealing his hand before correcting the angle. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm observing that the man who countersigned my father's military orders for 15 years is now leading the investigation into those same orders. And I am observing that no one in this room seems troubled by that contradiction." The quartet stopped playing. Whether by coincidence or instinct, the musicians had sensed the atmospheric shift and frozen. Lady Margot Turreau stepped forward from a cluster of wives near the fireplace, sharp-featured, political to her marrow. One of the 3 people who had seconded the tribunal motion. "Are you accusing Cassavane of complicity, Your Grace?" "I am stating a fact. Cassavane endorsed every action my father took during his governance, every military deployment, every political prosecution, every execution. If this tribunal is genuinely interested in accountability, then Cassavane should be sitting on the other side of that table, not presiding over it." The room went quiet. Not the performative silence of a social gathering absorbing a mild scandal. The absolute silence of people who have suddenly understood that the man they came to bury has arrived with a shovel of his own. Margot recovered first. "You are deflecting. The letters are public knowledge. Your concealment of your relationship with the Vane woman is the issue under investigation, not Cassavane's political record." "My concealment." Kedrick's voice dropped half a register. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that makes people lean forward, because their bodies recognize the sound of something about to break. "Let me tell you what I concealed, Lady Turreau. I concealed 27 letters from a woman my father executed on fabricated charges. I concealed the fact that the treason case that justified her death was manufactured by Harlan Goss on my father's direct orders, using military intelligence that never existed, corroborated by witnesses who were coerced under threat of imprisonment." He reached into his coat, produced a single document, held it up so the candlelight caught the handwriting. "And I concealed this. A memo from my father to his chief of intelligence, signed 3 days before the execution, ordering the permanent resolution of what he called the Vane complication, countersigned by Aldrin Cassavane." Nobody breathed. Kedrick set the document on the nearest table. "If this tribunal wants the truth, I will give it the truth. All of it. Every document in my father's archive. Every order, every signature, every name. He looked around the room slowly, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "But I should warn you. My father was a meticulous man. He kept records of everything. And those records do not stop at House Valamont." Devereaux's face had gone the color of candle wax. Margot Turreau's hand tightened around her glass until her knuckles whitened. Somewhere in the back of the room, a man whose name Cedric had seen on 3 of his father's requisition orders set down his drink and left without excusing himself. Cedric looked at Devereaux. "You wanted transparency," he said. "You are about to get it." He turned and walked out of the drawing room into the cold night air. Behind him, the gathering collapsed into the particular chaos that erupts when powerful people realize simultaneously that the weapon they built to destroy someone else has been turned to point directly at their own hearts. Cedric sat in the carriage alone as it pulled away from Devereaux's estate. The horses found their rhythm on the dark road. The carriage lantern threw moving shadows across the leather interior. His hands rested on his knees and they were not shaking. That was the thing he noticed. The steadiness. For 72 hours, his hands had trembled every time he touched the letters, every time he stood in the vault, every time the weight of what his father had done pressed against the walls of his chest. But tonight, standing in a room full of enemies and holding up the evidence that could demolish everything, his hands had been absolutely still, because survival was a language his body understood even when the rest of him was falling apart. His pulse slowed during confrontation the way other men's pulses slowed during sleep. His breathing regulated. His voice found its lowest register, the one that operated below conscious thought, the one his father had trained into him before he was old enough to understand what training meant. He hated that it worked. He hated that the part of him most effective at protecting what remained of his life was the part his father had built. That the machinery of dominance operated independently of the man inside it, running on fuel refined from every cruel lesson, every calculated performance, every moment he had stood beside Octavian Valamont and absorbed the architecture of control until it became structural, until it lived in his skeleton and operated his face and spoke with his voice regardless of whether the person behind it wanted to participate. Alara had seen it, even then, even 20 years ago when they sat on that bench in the garden after midnight, and she traced the lines of his palm like she was reading a map of damage that had not yet been fully inflicted. "You are not him yet. Please do not become him." The carriage rounded the hill, and Blackthorn Castle appeared against the night sky. Dark stone, lit windows, the silhouette of a structure built to withstand siege. Cedric looked at it and felt nothing. Not pride, not security, not the possessive satisfaction that a man is supposed to feel when he looks at the fortress that bears his family name. Just the dull recognition that the building would outlast whatever happened inside it. That stone does not care who owns it. That walls do not grieve when the people they shelter destroy each other. He reached inside his coat and touched the folded letter he still carried. The original. The one that had fallen from the chronicle. Cream-colored, worn soft. "My dearest Cedric, if they ever force you to hate me, remember that I loved you before the Empire ever did." He had shown Devereaux's gathering the Goss memo. He had threatened them with his father's archives. He had watched their faces crack and felt the room recalibrate around the understanding that Cedric Valamont was not a man being led to slaughter, but a man choosing exactly how much damage to inflict on the way down. And now, sitting alone in a dark carriage with the castle rising ahead of him, he understood with perfect clarity that what he had done tonight could not be undone. The document was public, the names were spoken, the threat was delivered. By morning, Cassavane would know, Devereaux would know. Every house whose signature appeared in Octavian's archive would know that the Duke was no longer protecting the system his father built. He was dismantling it. Not because he wanted justice. Justice was a word for people who still believed the world operated on principles. Cedric had stopped believing that the night he watched Alara search the crowd for his face and understood that principles were luxuries afforded to people who had never been forced to choose between love and power. He was dismantling it because the alternative was continuing to be the man his father had designed. And that man had stood in a crowd 20 years ago and done nothing, while the only person who ever loved him without conditions was dragged to her death. The carriage stopped. Cedric stepped out into the courtyard, and standing at the castle entrance, flanked by 2 soldiers carrying sealed dispatch cases, was Lord Chancellor Hargrove. His face told Cedric everything before his mouth opened. They moved the tribunal date, Hargrove said. Cassavane petitioned the king 2 hours ago. Emergency session. The hearing begins tomorrow at dawn. Full attendance mandatory. And they have issued a subpoena for your father's complete archive. The night air was cold and still and tasted like stone and coming rain. Kedrick looked at Hargrove, then at the castle behind him, then at the sky where clouds were gathering over Arctur in formations that looked less like weather and more like a verdict being delivered from a height that no amount of power could reach. Then we give them the archive, Kedrick said. Your Grace, if those documents become public record, every alliance your family has built in the last 30 years collapses. Cassavane, Devereux, Terraud, Verzen, they will all be implicated. They will fight back. They will destroy you to protect themselves. Yes, Kedrick said, they will try. He walked past Hargrove into the castle. Behind him, the Chancellor stood in the courtyard holding the dispatch cases and understanding, with the particular horror of a man who has spent his career managing political survival, that Duke Kedrick Valamont had stopped trying to survive. He had started trying to tell the truth. And in an empire built on lies, that was the most dangerous weapon anyone had ever carried into a tribunal. The Iron Parliament Hall had been designed 3 centuries ago by an architect who understood that justice was a performance before it was a principle. The ceiling rose 40 feet above the chamber floor, supported by columns of black granite quarried from the northern mountains. The tribunal bench sat elevated on a platform 6 steps above ground level, forcing anyone who stood before it to look upward, to crane their neck, to feel the physical weight of institutional authority pressing down on them before a single word was spoken. Kedrick had stood on that platform dozens of times, judging, sentencing, watching men realize that the system they had trusted to protect them was now the instrument of their destruction. He had never stood below it. Until now. Dawn had not fully broken when he arrived. The sky outside the Parliament's eastern windows was the color of a bruise, purple-gray, streaked with the kind of thin cloud cover that promised neither rain nor relief. The hall was already half full. Nobles in formal dress, military officers in ceremonial uniforms. Journalists crowded into a press gallery that had been expanded overnight to accommodate the demand. The entire capital had descended on the Parliament because the Empire understood, with the collective instinct that large populations develop when historical fractures are imminent, that whatever happened today would redraw the map. Kedrick wore no uniform, no medals, no ceremonial sword, dark coat, white shirt. The kind of deliberate simplicity that communicated either humility or contempt, depending on who was reading it. He carried 2 leather cases. One contained the archive documents he had retrieved from the East Wing vault. The other contained the 27 letters. Seraphine walked 3 steps behind him. She had not asked permission to attend. She had simply appeared in the corridor outside their chambers at 5 in the morning, dressed in charcoal gray, her hair pulled back with a severity that stripped away every trace of the ornamental Duchess the Empire was accustomed to seeing. The diamonds were gone. The emerald silks were gone. What remained was a woman who looked like she had spent the night making calculations that did not include sentiment. They did not speak during the carriage ride. They did not speak walking into the hall. They did not speak as they took their positions, Kedrick standing before the tribunal bench, and Seraphine seated in the front row of the observation gallery, separated by 12 feet of marble floor and the particular distance that develops between 2 people who understand that the next few hours will determine whether anything between them survives. Lord Chancellor Hargrove was already present, seated at the council table to Kedrick's right, surrounded by documents he had organized through the night. His face carried the gray, hollow quality of a man who has not slept, and has accepted that sleep is no longer relevant to his immediate future. He glanced at Kedrick as the Duke took his position. The look was brief, professional, and underneath it something Kedrick did not recognize. He should have recognized it. The tribunal bench seated 7. Lord Cassavane presided at center, Lady Terraud to his left, the Count of Versen to his right. 4 additional members drawn from the senior judiciary, career magistrates whose political loyalties were distributed across factional lines that Kedrick had spent years mapping and, when necessary, manipulating. Cassavane called the session to order at 6:15. His voice was measured, controlled. the voice of a man who had rehearsed his performance until the seams disappeared. This tribunal has been convened under emergency authority granted by the Crown to investigate matters of historical governance pertaining to House Valamon. The scope encompasses political prosecutions, military deployments, and administrative actions undertaken during the governance of Duke Octavian Valamon and continued under Duke Cedric Valamont. He paused. Let the silence do its work. The accused may address the tribunal. Cedric stepped forward. I am not the accused, he said. I requested to appear voluntarily, and I have brought the complete contents of my father's personal archive for submission to this tribunal. He placed the first leather case on the evidence table. Cassavain's expression did not change, but his eyes moved to the case with a speed that betrayed something underneath the judicial composure. Interest. Calculation. The rapid assessment of a man determining whether the weapon he had constructed was still pointing in the direction he intended. The tribunal acknowledges the voluntary submission, Cassavain said. Lord Chancellor Hargrove, as counsel to House Valamont, do you affirm the completeness of these documents? Hargrove stood. And that was the moment. Not the betrayal itself. The moment before. The fraction of a second when Hargrove's posture shifted from the familiar alignment of a man standing to support his employer to something subtly different. A straightening of the spine, a squaring of the shoulders, the physical recalibration of a man who has been leaning in one direction for years and is about to lean in another. Cedric saw it. His body registered it before his mind processed it. A tightening in his chest, a cooling of the skin across his forearms. The autonomic warning system that had kept him alive through 20 years of political warfare, firing signals that arrived too fast for conscious thought and too late for preventive action. I affirm the completeness of the submitted documents, Hargrove said. Then he paused. However, one word, delivered with the careful precision of a scalpel being positioned before the first incision. However, in my capacity as counsel and in accordance with my obligation to this tribunal, I must also submit additional materials that have come into my possession during the preparation of House Valamont's response. Hargrove reached beneath the counsel table and produced a third case, leather, sealed with wax that Cedric did not recognize. The hall went silent. Cedric looked at the case, then at Hargrove, and felt the architecture of the room rearrange itself around him. The walls did not move. The ceiling did not descend. The floor did not tilt. But everything shifted. The geometry of loyalty that he had relied upon for 12 years, the fundamental assumption that the man standing 3 feet to his right was operating within the same strategic framework, evaporated so completely that the air itself seemed to thin. What materials? Cedric asked. His voice was steady. It cost him everything to make it steady. Hargrove did not look at him. Addressed the tribunal bench directly. A man who had already made his choice and was no longer interested in the reaction of the person that choice would destroy. During my review of House Valamont's records in preparation for this proceeding, I discovered a second archive, not in the East Wing vault, which the Duke has voluntarily submitted, a separate collection of documents maintained independently by Duke Octavian Valamont in a secure location within Blackthorn Castle that was not included in the materials the current Duke presented. I was not aware of a second archive, Cedric said. I know, Hargrove replied, and still did not look at him. The case was opened. Documents were distributed to the tribunal bench, 7 copies, prepared in advance, organized, tabbed. The work of a man who had spent days, possibly weeks, building this moment while standing beside the person he was about to eviscerate. Cassavain reviewed the first page. His expression remained neutral, but his hands were steady in the way that only happens when someone is reading exactly what they expected to find. Lord Chancellor, Cassavain said, can you summarize the contents for the record? The documents contain Duke Octavian's personal intelligence logs covering the final 18 months of his governance. They include detailed records of surveillance operations, political eliminations, and financial transactions that extend significantly beyond the scope of the Vane prosecution. Hargrove paused. They also contain correspondence between Duke Octavian and his son, then heir Cedric Valamont, regarding the strategic management of what Octavian referred to as the succession protocol. Cedric's blood cooled. He felt it happen. Not metaphorically. physiologically. The vessels in his extremities constricting as adrenaline redistributed blood flow toward core organs. A survival response. The body preparing for impact before the mind fully comprehended the nature of the collision. "What succession protocol?" Lady Thurl asked. Hargrove finally looked at Kaedric. And in that look, Kaedric saw everything. The 12 years of service, the late nights reviewing strategy, the quiet counsel during political crises, the steady presence at his shoulder during military operations, diplomatic negotiations, and the 1,000 small decisions that accumulated into the machinery of governance. All of it recontextualized in a single glance. All of it revealed as something other than what it had appeared to be. Hargrove had never been his advisor. He had been his father's final instrument, placed, positioned, maintained in proximity to the heir for 12 years with the specific purpose of activating at exactly this moment. A weapon with a delayed fuse, buried so deep inside the structure of Kaedric's daily life that it had become invisible. Octavian Valamont had been dead for 20 years, and he was still controlling his son. "The succession protocol," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the flat, uninflected quality of a man delivering testimony he had memorized, was a series of communications between Duke Octavian and his heir regarding the management of the Van affair. The documents indicate that the then heir was not merely aware of the fabricated charges against Alara Vane. He was consulted on their construction. The hall erupted, not gradually, not in stages, instantly. The sound of 600 people reacting simultaneously to the detonation of a narrative they had already absorbed and processed and built their understanding around. The love letter story, the hidden romance, the grieving Duke undone by a secret he had carried for 20 years, all of it reframed in a single sentence. He had not been a passive victim of his father's cruelty. He had been a participant. "That is a lie," Kaedric said. His voice cut through the noise. Not with volume, with density. The particular compression of sound that happens when a man speaks from a place so deep inside himself that the words arrive carrying the weight of everything above them. "The documents are in your handwriting, Your Grace," Hargrove said. "I have never seen those documents." The tribunal's forensic experts have been provided samples for comparison. The analysis is included in the submission. Kaedric turned to the tribunal bench. "This is manufactured evidence. Hargrove has been compromised. Someone on this bench knows exactly what is happening because someone on this bench arranged it." Cassavane's gavel came down. "The accused will maintain decorum." "I am not the accused." "As of this moment, Your Grace, you are." The gavel struck again, and the sound ricocheted off the granite columns and the vaulted ceiling and came back multiplied, harder, louder, transformed by the acoustics of a room designed to make authority feel like physics. Kaedric stood still. His body remained upright through mechanisms that had nothing to do with will and everything to do with the engineering his father had installed in him decades ago. The posture that does not collapse because it was never supported by anything voluntary in the first place. The architecture of a man who learned before adolescence that displaying damage was a form of surrender that invited further attack. But inside the collapse was total. Not because the accusation was true. It was not true. He had not participated in the construction of the charges against Alara. He had learned of them after the fact, too late, presented with a finished prosecution by a father who did not consult his children but informed them the way weather informs the landscape. The collapse was because the accusation did not need to be true. It needed to be believable. And it was believable because 20 years ago, Kaedric Valamont had stood in a crowd and watched the woman he loved be dragged to her execution and done nothing. He had not protested. He had not intervened. He had not spoken a single word in her defense. And then he had spent 2 decades governing with the same cold precision as the man who ordered her death, making the same calculations, applying the same logic, building the same kind of empire on the same kind of silence. The evidence was forged, but the story it told was close enough to the truth to be indistinguishable from it. And Hargrove knew that. Hargrove had spent 12 years watching Kaedric close enough to understand exactly where the fault lines ran, exactly which accusations would resonate, exactly which version of events the Empire would find most satisfying. Because empires do not want truth. They want narrative. They want a shape that fits the space they have already prepared for it. The tribunal recessed at noon. Cedric was escorted to a holding chamber adjacent to the Parliament Hall. Not arrested. Not formally. But the escort was comprised of 4 soldiers who positioned themselves at the doors with the unmistakable body language of men following containment orders rather than ceremonial protocol. The chamber was small: stone walls, a table, 2 chairs, a window that looked out onto an interior courtyard where pigeons roosted on ledges that had been collecting bird waste for decades. Seraphine was allowed entry after 15 minutes. She had argued with the guards. Cedric heard her voice through the walls, not the words but the tone, the controlled ferocity of a woman who understood that the difference between a request and a demand was simply a matter of how much the person making it was willing to risk. She came in and closed the door and stood across from him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. "You did not know," she said finally. It was not a question. "No. The documents are forgeries." "Yes." "Can you prove it?" "Not quickly enough." She sat down, placed both hands flat on the table. The gesture was practical, grounding, the physical equivalent of a person establishing a baseline before calculating distance. "Hargrove has been in your household for 12 years. He has had access to your handwriting, your personal correspondence, your strategic planning documents. He has had 12 years to study your syntax, your word choices, your signature variations under different conditions. If the forgeries are competent, and they will be because Hargrove is competent, the forensic analysis will not be definitive enough to overturn them before the tribunal reaches its verdict." "I know." "Cassavane has the bench. 5 of 7 members will vote with him. The other 2 lack sufficient political weight to force a dissent into the record." "I know." "Then you understand what this means." Cedric looked at her. The woman sitting across from him was not the Duchess who wore emerald silk to state functions and managed social calendars with the precision of a military operation. She was not the political partner who coordinated their public appearances and ensured that House Valamont's image remained flawless across every visible surface. She was something he had not seen before, or something he had seen and never recognized, because recognizing it would have required him to acknowledge that Seraphine possessed dimensions he had never bothered to explore. She was a strategist, not the ceremonial kind, not the decorative intelligence that powerful men tolerate in their wives because it flatters their own judgment to have it reflected back at them. The operational kind. The kind that built independent intelligence networks and maintained contacts in rival households and understood political machinery not as an abstraction, but as a system of levers and pressures that could be manipulated by anyone willing to learn where the fulcrum sat. "They're going to strip your title," she said. "Confiscate Blackthorn. Redistribute your territories among the houses that supported the tribunal motion. Cassavane takes the political infrastructure. Devereaux takes the military contracts. Tarot takes the northern trade routes. Every family that signed your father's orders walks away clean because you, Cedric Valamont, become the receptacle for all of it. Every crime, every execution, every fabrication. You become the villain the Empire needs so that everyone else can remain the hero." "Yes." "And you were going to let it happen?" He did not answer, because the answer was complicated in ways that words could not accommodate. Yes, a part of him had been prepared to accept it, not out of nobility, not out of some performative sacrifice that would earn him posthumous redemption, out of exhaustion. 20 years of carrying the weight of something monstrous and being unable to set it down because setting it down meant admitting that he had been carrying it in the first place. "Cedric." He looked at her. "I did not spend 11 years building a life inside this dynasty to watch it handed to Aldrin Cassavane by a man too tired to fight for it. This is not about fatigue." "Then what is it about?" "It is about the fact that Hargrove is right." The sentence landed in the chamber like something dropped from a height. Seraphine stared at him. "Not about the documents," Cedric said. "Those are forged. But the story they tell, the version of events where I participated, where I knew, where I chose the Empire over her and then spent 20 years pretending the choice was made for me." He stopped. His breathing had changed. The shallow, controlled rhythm that his body maintained during confrontation had fractured into something uneven, raw. "I did choose Seraphine, not the way Hargrove describes. not by helping construct the charges, but by doing nothing, by standing in that crowd and choosing silence, by spending 20 years refusing to investigate because investigation would have meant facing what I already knew. What you already knew. That my father murdered her, that I let him, that everything I built afterward was compensation, performance. A man constructing an empire on top of a grave and calling it legacy because the alternative was admitting that the grave existed. Seraphine was quiet for a long time. The pigeons on the courtyard ledge shifted and resettled. Afternoon light moved across the stone walls in slow degrees. The sounds of the Parliament building filtered through, doors opening and closing, footsteps echoing in corridors, the distant murmur of voices discussing the destruction of a dynasty the way people discuss weather patterns. "Then stop performing," she said. "I do not know what that looks like." "It looks like walking back into that tribunal and telling the truth. Not the version Hargrove manufactured, not the version Cassavane needs, the actual truth. That you were a 23-year-old heir who was too afraid of his father to save the woman he loved, and that you have spent 20 years becoming the man your father wanted because becoming anything else would have required facing what you did. That will not save the dynasty." "No," Seraphine said. "It will not." She stood, walked to the window, looked out at the courtyard with the same assessing gaze she applied to everything, measuring angles, calculating trajectories, determining which surfaces would support weight and which would fracture. "But it might save you," she said. "And right now, Kadric, you are the only part of this dynasty worth saving." He looked at her, and something recalibrated, not dramatically, not with the cinematic clarity of a man experiencing revelation. With the slow, grinding reluctance of a mechanism that has been running in one direction for 20 years, being forced to reverse. Gears catching, resistance building, the structural protest of a system that was never designed to operate this way because the man who built it never intended for his son to have the option. Kadric stood. He picked up the second leather case, the one containing the letters. 27 letters from a woman his father had murdered because love was a variable that could not be controlled. "If I do this," he said, "there is no House Valamont afterward, no dynasty, no title, no territory. Everything my family built for 3 centuries ends in that tribunal chamber." "I know. You married into this house. You invested 11 years. Your own family's position depends on the alliance." "I know. And you are telling me to destroy it." Seraphine turned from the window. The afternoon light caught her face, and for one instant she looked like someone he had never met. Someone who existed beneath the layers of political partnership and strategic composure, and the careful distance that had defined every interaction between them since the day they signed the marriage contract in front of witnesses who applauded the merger of bloodlines without once asking whether either participant wanted to be there. "I am telling you to stop being the man your father built," she said. "Whatever comes after that is something we figure out when we get there." Kadric held the case against his chest. The leather was warm from his hands. Inside it, 27 letters waited. Words written by a woman who had loved him before the Empire did. Words that had been hidden and buried and carried in secret for 2 decades by a man who could conquer territories but could not face the cost of his own silence. He walked to the door, knocked twice. The guards opened it. The corridor stretched toward the tribunal chamber, long and lined with portraits of rulers who had built the systems he was about to dismantle. Men who had made the same calculations. Men who had chosen power over truth and called the choice governance and passed the cost to the next generation like debt that compounds in the dark. Kadric Valamont walked toward the chamber carrying 27 letters and no plan, and the absolute certainty that the man who entered that room would not be the man who left it, because the man who entered still had a dynasty to protect. And the man who left would have nothing except the truth about what his family had done and the wreckage of every lie that had ever kept him standing. Behind him, Seraphine followed, not as his Duchess, not as his political partner, not as the woman who had spent 11 years occupying the role his empire required, as the only person left in Valadorn who had looked at him honestly and decided he was worth more than the machinery he operated. And ahead, in the tribunal chamber, Cassavane and Hargrove and every noble house that had built its fortune on Octavian Valamont's crimes sat waiting, confident, prepared, certain that the system they had constructed would hold because it had always held, because the architecture of power does not fail. Because the men who designed it understood human weakness well enough to account for every variable except one. They had not accounted for a man who was no longer afraid of losing everything, because he had already lost the only thing that ever mattered 20 years ago on a public scaffold, while an empire cheered and he stood silent, and Alara Vane searched the crowd for his face one final time. The tribunal chamber doors were 12 feet tall and made of iron-banded oak that had been hung during the original construction of the parliament 3 centuries ago. They required 2 men to open. The hinges had been oiled that morning, but still produced a sound when they swung, a low groan that traveled through the floor and up through the soles of Caedric's boots and into the architecture of his legs and settled somewhere in his chest where it joined the other vibrations accumulating there. The heartbeat that had shifted from its regulated 62 beats per minute to something faster, something his body had not produced since the night 20 years ago, when he stood in a crowd and watched Alara search for his face and made a decision that had defined every second of his existence since. He walked into the chamber carrying the leather case. 600 people turned to watch him. The afternoon session had been called to order 12 minutes earlier. The tribunal bench was fully occupied. Cassavane at center, his hands folded on the judicial desk with the symmetrical precision of a man who believed that composure was a form of victory. Tarot to his left, reviewing documents with the performative concentration of someone who already knew what they contained. The Count of Versailles to the right, sweating visibly along his hairline despite the chamber's ventilation. The 4 remaining magistrates arranged in descending order of political relevance, faces calibrated to project institutional neutrality, while their eyes tracked Caedric with the involuntary attention that prey animals give to movement in peripheral vision. Hargrove sat at the council table. He did not look up when Caedric entered. His hands were still. His posture had not changed. The same straight back, the same squared shoulders, the same carefully maintained physical framework of a man who had made his decision and was no longer negotiating with it. Caedric stopped at the center of the floor. The marble beneath his feet was cold. He could feel it through his boots, the kind of deep structure cold that radiates upward from stone that has never been warmed because the building was designed to resist comfort. To remind every person who stood here that institutions outlast individuals, that the floor will be here long after the man standing on it has been forgotten. The tribunal recognizes Duke Caedric Valemont, Cassavane said. You were absent during the opening of the afternoon session. Do you wish to explain? No. Cassavane's eyes narrowed by a fraction. A man accustomed to defendants who explain, who justify, who fill silence with words that can be used against them later. Caedric's refusal to perform that function disrupted the rhythm Cassavane had choreographed. Very well. The tribunal has reviewed the supplementary materials submitted by Lord Chancellor Hargrove during this morning's session. The documents appear to indicate your direct involvement in the construction of the treason charges against Alara Vane. You have denied this. Do you wish to amend your statement? I do not wish to amend my statement. I wish to replace it. Movement in the gallery. The journalist leaned forward. The scratching of pencils against paper intensified. 600 people adjusted their breathing collectively, the way audiences do when they sense that the performance they paid to see is about to justify the price. Caedric set the leather case on the evidence table, opened it, removed the 27 letters, and placed them in a single stack beside the case. These are the personal correspondence of Alara Vane, written to me over a period of 2 years before her execution. I have carried them for 20 years. They are the reason a letter fell from my chronicle 4 days ago. They are the reason this tribunal exists, and they are the only honest thing I have ever possessed. He looked at Cassavane. I did not participate in the construction of the treason charges. The documents Hargrove submitted are forgeries, but that is not what I came to say. Then what did you come to say, Your Grace? Caedric's hand rested on the stack of letters. The paper was warm from being held, from being carried against his body during the walk from the holding chamber to this room. 27 letters that had spent 2 decades hidden behind a false panel in his study and were now sitting on a table in front of 600 people and the entire political machinery of an empire that was about to use them as kindling. I came to tell the truth, he said. Not the version that saves House Valemont. Not the version that destroys it conveniently enough for the rest of you to walk away clean. The truth. The tribunal is listening. 22 years ago, I was the heir to a dynasty governed by a man who understood power the way surgeons understand anatomy. My father did not rule through ideology or vision or any of the words we carve into monuments to make governance sound noble. He ruled through the systematic identification and elimination of threats. Anything that introduced instability into his control structure was a threat. Political opposition was a threat. Military independence was a threat. And love. Love was the most dangerous threat of all, because it could not be predicted, could not be contained, and could not be destroyed through the mechanisms that worked on everything else. His voice carried through the chamber without effort, not because he was projecting, because the room was designed to amplify the human voice, and Kaedric's voice had been trained to operate within exactly this kind of acoustic architecture. But something underneath the training had changed. The sound was different, stripped of the controlled resonance that had characterized every public statement he had made for the past decade. What remained was rawer, rougher, the voice of a man speaking without the intermediary of performance for the first time in his adult life. I met Alara Vane when I was 21. She was the daughter of a royal archivist. She was brilliant and fearless, and she had absolutely no interest in the power I represented. She challenged me in public debates. She questioned decisions that no one else dared to question. She looked at me and saw a person instead of a title, and that terrified me more than any military threat I've ever faced. Because I had been taught since childhood that personhood was weakness, that the parts of a ruler that are human are the parts that enemies exploit. He paused. The chamber was silent, the kind of silence that develops its own pressure, that pushes against the walls and the ceiling and the people sitting inside it until everyone in the room can feel the weight of attention focused on a single point. I loved her. I loved her in a way I was not equipped to handle because love requires vulnerability, and I had been engineered from birth to treat vulnerability as a structural defect. So I hid it. We met in secret. We wrote letters. We built an entire relationship inside the margins of an empire that would have destroyed us both if it knew. And for 2 years, I was the closest thing to an actual human being I have ever been. Your Grace, Cassavane interrupted, the tribunal is not a venue for personal confession. If you have evidence to present regarding the charges, I am presenting evidence. I am presenting the evidence that none of you want to hear because it implicates every person in this room. Cassavane's gavel hovered above the bench. Did not strike. The instinct to restore order competed with the instinct to let Kaedric continue speaking, because a man confessing in public is a man creating a record that can be used against him, and Cassavane was intelligent enough to recognize ammunition when it was being handed to him freely. Continue, he said carefully. My father discovered the relationship. He summoned me to his study and he gave me a choice. Protect Alara or inherit the empire. Not both. Never both. Because in my father's framework, the two were mutually exclusive. A man who loves is a man who can be leveraged. A man who can be leveraged is a man who cannot rule. Kaedric's hand pressed harder against the letters. His knuckles whitened. The physical manifestation of internal pressure finding the nearest available surface and distributing itself through contact. I chose the empire. 3 words, delivered flat, without effect. The way a man reports a casualty figure because the alternative, acknowledging the individual deaths contained within the number, would render him unable to speak at all. I watched my father manufacture the treason charges. I watched him fabricate evidence through Harlan Goss. I watched the trial proceed on testimony extracted from witnesses who were threatened with imprisonment if they did not cooperate. And I watched Alara Vane dragged to her execution while she searched the crowd for me. His voice cracked. A single fracture in the controlled emission of sound. He corrected it immediately. Sealed the breach. Continued. She found me. She looked directly at me. And she saw that I was not going to save her. That the man she loved had chosen the thing she had spent 2 years trying to convince him was not worth choosing. And then she was gone. The gallery had gone rigid. Journalists had stopped writing. Nobles who had arrived prepared to witness a political execution were instead witnessing something far more disturbing. A man dismantling himself in public, pulling out the internal walls one by one and laying them on the floor for inspection. I did not help construct the charges. Hargrove's documents are forgeries designed to make my complicity appear active rather than passive. But passive complicity is still complicity. I knew. I watched. I did nothing. And then I spent 20 years becoming exactly the kind of ruler my father wanted me to become, because becoming anything else would have required me to face what I had allowed to happen. Every military decision I have made, every political alliance I have constructed, every territory I have conquered or absorbed, all of it built on top of a murder I permitted through silence. He turned to face the gallery directly. 600 faces arranged in ascending rows, lit by the afternoon light filtering through the Parliament's high windows. Noble families, military commanders, diplomats, journalists, the infrastructure of an empire that was hearing, for the first time, the actual foundation upon which it had been built. But I am not the only one. The temperature in the room changed, not literally, but the collective physiological response of 600 people simultaneously recognizing danger produced a shift in atmosphere that was as tangible as a drop in barometric pressure. Kedrick turned back to the tribunal bench. Lord Cassavane, you countersigned the military deployment order that arrested Alara Vane. Your signature appears on the authorization for the intelligence operation that manufactured the evidence against her. You attended the trial. You endorsed the verdict. And 3 months after the execution, you received a grant of 1,600 acres of former Vane family land redistributed by my father as compensation for services rendered during what he described in his personal records as the stabilization effort. Cassavane's hands, still folded on the judicial desk, tightened against each other. The knuckles blanched. The composure held, but the effort required to maintain it became visible in the cords of his neck and the slight dilation of his pupils. Lady Tarot, your family supplied 4 of the witnesses who testified against Alara Vane. Your husband, the late Count Tarot, personally supervised the detention of 3 members of the Vane household staff who were held without charges for 11 months before being released on the condition that they leave Valadorn permanently. None of them were ever seen again. Tarot's face drained of color in stages, first the cheeks, then the forehead, then the lips. Like watching a photograph develop in reverse, detail bleeding away until what remained was the blank, bleached expression of a woman confronting the return of something she had spent 2 decades believing was permanently buried. The Count of Versennes, Lord Devereux, Lady Harmond, Baron Cresswell. Kedrick named them one by one, each name accompanied by specific details extracted from his father's archive: signatures, authorizations, financial transfers, land redistributions, the documented architecture of a conspiracy that had involved not one man but an entire social class, every member of which had participated in the destruction of Alara Vane and profited from her death, and then spent 20 years performing righteousness while standing on her grave. The chamber broke apart, not all at once, in sections, like a structure failing under distributed load. The press gallery erupted first, journalists shouting questions that overlapped into incomprehensible noise. Then the noble families, some rising from their seats, others turning to each other with the rapid, urgent exchanges of people who have just realized that the explosion they came to watch is expanding to include them. Then the military officers, stone-faced but shifting in their seats with the particular discomfort of men who understand that institutional loyalty is a contract that has just been voided. Cassavane's gavel crashed against the bench. Once, twice, 3 times. Order! This tribunal will have order. This tribunal, Kedrick said, his voice cutting through the noise with a precision that silenced the nearest rows by sheer acoustic force, is a performance staged by men who are more guilty than I am. You did not convene this investigation to uncover the truth. You convened it to control the narrative, to ensure that when the letters became public and the Empire started asking questions, the answers pointed at House Valamont and nowhere else. At a dead duke and his surviving son. Convenient targets. Contained targets. Targets whose destruction would satisfy the Empire's appetite for accountability without requiring anyone else to answer for what they did. You are in contempt of this tribunal. I am in contempt of everything this tribunal represents. The gavel came down again. The sound was losing its authority. Repetition was eroding its impact the way water erodes stone, each strike carrying less weight than the last because the room was no longer listening to the gavel. The room was listening to Kedrick. Lord Chancellor Hargrove. Kedrick turned to face the man who had betrayed him, The man who had spent 12 years embedded in his household. The man who had eaten at his table and reviewed his correspondence and offered counsel during late-night strategy sessions, and been present for 1,000 private moments that now recontextualize themselves as surveillance. Who sent you? Hargrove looked at him. For the first time since the morning session, their eyes met directly. No one sent me, Your Grace. Someone placed you in my household 12 years ago with instructions that are activating now. Someone provided you with the resources to forge documents in my handwriting. Someone coordinated with Cassavane to accelerate the tribunal timeline so that I would not have sufficient opportunity to mount a defense. That level of orchestration does not happen spontaneously. Your father placed me. The words landed in the chamber, and the chamber absorbed them, and for 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Your father recruited me 18 months before his death, Hargrove continued. His voice was steady, the steadiness of a man delivering a prepared statement, rehearsed, refined, every word selected for maximum impact and minimum deniability. He instructed me to embed within your household after his death, to monitor your governance, to report to a designated contact within the senior aristocracy, and to activate if you ever showed signs of what he described as emotional compromise. Emotional compromise. The love letters, the connection to Alara Vane, your father anticipated that it would resurface eventually, that you would not be able to sustain the suppression indefinitely. He called it a structural vulnerability. He built contingencies. Kedrick absorbed this the way his body absorbed all catastrophic information, through the peripheral systems rather than the central processor. His breathing did not change, his posture did not shift, but his pulse hammered in his temples and the blood in his extremities cooled by another degree, and somewhere deep in the mechanical core of the man his father had constructed, a sound like tearing metal resonated through the load-bearing walls. Octavian Valamon had been dead for 20 years, and he was still winning, still controlling his son through instruments placed decades in advance, still manipulating the architecture of an empire from beyond the grave through the patient, methodical deployment of human assets programmed with specific activation conditions. Hargrove was not a traitor. He was a timer, a delayed action device built into the structure of Kaedric's life, with the precise purpose of detonating if the structure showed signs of becoming something Octavian had not designed. Who is the designated contact? Kaedric asked. Hargrove said nothing. Who did you report to for 12 years? Silence. Kaedric turned to the tribunal bench, scanned the 7 faces. 5 of them held expressions of varying degrees of manufactured neutrality. One, the youngest magistrate on the far right, looked genuinely confused. And Cassavane. Cassavane looked calm. Not the performed calm of a man maintaining composure, the genuine calm of a man who is exactly where he planned to be, who has watched the situation develop according to a timeline he understands because he helped write it, whose hands remained folded on the judicial desk with the symmetrical precision of someone who knows how this ends, because the ending was determined before the tribunal was convened. You, Kedrick said. Cassavane's expression did not change. You were my father's contingency, not just his political ally, his successor. If I failed, if the heir showed weakness, if the architecture my father spent his life building showed cracks, you were the replacement mechanism, the man who would step in and continue the project. These are baseless accusations, Cassavane said. Then let the tribunal examine my father's archive in full, every document, every correspondence, every financial record, including the communications between my father and his designated contact within the senior aristocracy. Kaedric's voice dropped to a register that vibrated in the chest cavities of everyone sitting within 15 feet. Unless, Lord Cassavane, there is something in those records you would prefer this tribunal not see. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something, a pressure that built along the fault lines of every political calculation in the room, every alliance, every debt, every favor exchanged and recorded and buried in the expectation that burial was permanent. 600 people sat inside that pressure and felt it press against their individual architectures and understood, with varying degrees of clarity, that the man standing at the center of the chamber had just converted his own destruction into a weapon. Because Kyaedric Valamon had stopped trying to survive. A man trying to survive calculates risk, measures exposure, determines the minimum necessary concession to preserve the maximum possible position. That is what Cassavein had expected. That is what the tribunal had been designed to extract. A duke in damage control mode, negotiating terms, offering sacrifices, performing the ritual submission that powerful men perform when the system they serve turns against them. But Kyaedric was not performing. He was detonating. And a man with nothing left to lose does not calculate, does not measure, does not negotiate. He simply opens the doors and lets everything inside come out, regardless of what it destroys, regardless of who it reaches, regardless of whether the blast radius includes himself. Cassavein understood this 3 seconds too late. "This tribunal will recess," he said. "This tribunal will not recess," Kyaedric replied. "This tribunal will review the archive, now, in full, in front of 600 witnesses and the entire press gallery. Or this tribunal will explain to the Empire of Valadorn why the man presiding over an investigation into House Valamon's crimes is the same man who helped commit them." The gallery erupted. Journalists were standing, shouting. The noise built in layers until the chamber itself seemed to vibrate with the accumulated energy of an institution tearing itself apart in real time. Cassavein's gavel rose and fell, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. The other tribunal members were speaking simultaneously. Tarot was on her feet. Verzen was arguing with a magistrate. The military officers in the observation rows had shifted from seated attention to the alert, upright posture of men who sensed that the boundary between political proceeding and physical confrontation was eroding. Outside, through the Parliament's eastern windows, the afternoon light was failing. The sky over Arctur had turned the color of heated iron, dark gold bleeding into gray, and the first distant rumble of thunder reached the chamber like a stage direction written by someone who understood that certain moments in history come with their own weather. Kyaedric stood at the center of the chaos and felt his heart beat slow. Not through control, not through the breathing techniques his military trainers had taught him decades ago. Through something he did not have a name for, something that lived in the space below fear and beyond calculation. The particular stillness that arrives when a man has said everything he was afraid to say and done everything he was afraid to do, and the only thing remaining is the consequence. Seraphine was on her feet in the gallery. He found her face in the crowd the way a navigator finds a fixed point in shifting seas. She was not smiling. She was not crying. She was watching him with an expression that contained nothing he could name except the thing he had spent 20 years trying not to need. Recognition, not approval, not admiration, not the strategic assessment she applied to every situation, just the simple, devastating recognition of one person seeing another person clearly, seeing the damage and the fear and the 20 years of accumulated silence and the man who had finally stopped pretending that silence was strength. She saw him, and that was enough. The chamber doors burst open. Captain Thorne entered at a pace between a walk and a run, followed by 6 soldiers in field gear rather than ceremonial dress. Their boots left mud on the marble floor. Their faces carried the tight, controlled expression of men who had received orders that override protocol. "Your Grace!" Thorne's voice cut through the noise with military efficiency. "We have a situation outside." "Not now, Captain." "Sir, the city is burning." The word stopped the chamber the way a bullet stops a body. Instantly, completely. Every voice, every movement, every sound ceasing simultaneously as 600 people processed 4 words that rearranged every priority in the room. "Riots broke out in the merchant quarter 2 hours ago," Thorne reported. "The letter, the tribunal, the allegations, everything that has been said in this chamber today spread through the city before we could contain it. Protesters pulled down the Valamont monument in the central square. They are moving toward the Parliament. The garrison is attempting to establish a perimeter, but we do not have sufficient numbers to hold the outer streets and protect this building simultaneously." Through the eastern windows, the fading light was now stained with something darker. Smoke, rising in columns from multiple points across the capital. The distant thunder that Kyaedric had attributed to weather revealed itself as something else entirely. The sound of a city tearing itself apart. Cassavein was standing. His composure had fractured visibly. The hands that had been folded with judicial precision were gripping the edge of the bench. The color had left his face, and been replaced by the gray, waxy quality of a man who has just realized that the controlled demolition he orchestrated has breached its containment perimeter. "How many?" Kedrick asked Thorn. "Thousands. Growing. Multiple factions. Some are carrying vain portraits. Some are carrying your banners. Some are carrying nothing at all. The ones carrying nothing are the most dangerous." Kedrick looked at Cassavane, at Thoreau, at Hargrove, at the tribunal bench where 7 people sat elevated above the floor on a platform designed to project authority, and now looked like nothing more than 7 frightened individuals sitting on a stage while the theater burned around them. "You wanted the truth," Kedrick said. "The truth is that this empire was built on a murder. Every person in this room profited from it. Every noble house in Valadorn inherited something that was purchased with an innocent woman's life. And now the people outside, the 3 million people who were never asked whether they consented to any of it, have decided to collect the bill." Glass shattered somewhere in the building, a distant crash followed by shouting and the sound of boots on stone corridors. The perimeter was failing. The crowd was approaching the Parliament. Thorn stepped forward. "Your Grace, we need to evacuate. Now. The carriage entrance is still secure, but I cannot guarantee it for more than 20 minutes. Kedrick did not move. He stood at the center of the tribunal chamber while the empire his family had built for 3 centuries collapsed around him in real time. Smoke drifting past the windows. Thunder that was not thunder rolling through the streets. The sound of stone monuments being torn from their foundations by hands that had spent generations supporting them. And in the middle of all of it, standing on cold marble with 27 letters on the table beside him and the echoes of his own confession still resonating in the acoustics of a room designed to outlast the people inside it, Kedrick Valamont felt something he had not felt in 20 years. Freedom. Not the political kind. Not the freedom of power or position or the ability to move through the world without resistance. The raw, annihilating freedom of a man who has finally told the truth and discovered that the truth does not care whether empires survive it. "Your Grace," Thorn's voice was urgent now, military discipline fighting against the animal instinct to grab his commander and physically drag him toward the exit. "We are out of time." The chamber doors shuddered. Something heavy struck them from the other side. The iron-banded oak held, but the sound of the impact traveled through the frame and into the walls, and every person in the room understood that the next impact, or the one after that, or the one after that, would breach the barrier. Kedrick looked at Seraphine one more time. She was still standing, still watching, still holding his gaze with the steady, unflinching clarity of a woman who had decided what she was willing to lose and was no longer afraid of it. She nodded once. Kedrick turned to Thorn. "Get everyone out. Every noble, every journalist, every member of this tribunal. Use the eastern corridors. The crowd is concentrated on the western approach." "And you, sir?" Kedrick picked up the 27 letters from the evidence table, held them against his chest. "I need to speak to the people outside." Thorn stared at him. The professional composure that 12 years of military service had built into his face collapsed for one instant into the naked, unfiltered expression of a man who has just heard his commanding officer issue an order that amounts to walking directly into the path of a charging army. "Sir, that crowd will tear you apart." "Maybe." "Your Grace." "Get them out, Thorn, all of them. That is an order." The chamber doors shuddered again. The hinges groaned. Dust fell from the stone above the frame. And Kedrick Valamont walked toward them, toward the sound, toward the crowd, toward the empire that his father had built and he had maintained and that was now consuming itself in fire and fury and the accumulated rage of a population that had just discovered the murder beneath their history. Behind him, the tribunal bench emptied. Cassavane fled first, then Thoreau, then the magistrates. One by one, the architects of the investigation that was supposed to destroy Kedrick Valamont abandoned the room they had designed as his execution chamber and ran for the exits while the man they had tried to bury walked in the opposite direction, toward the doors, toward the fire, toward the only thing left that mattered, the truth. And whatever it cost to speak it one more time. The doors opened and the sound hit him first, not the roar he had expected, not the singular wall of noise that his military training had taught him to anticipate from hostile crowds. Something worse, something layered. Thousands of individual voices producing thousands of individual sounds that merged and separated and merged again in patterns that had no center and no direction and no leader. The sound of a population that had stopped performing order and started expressing what lived underneath it. The steps of the Iron Parliament descended 30 feet to a stone plaza that connected to the main avenue leading toward the central square. The plaza was full. The avenue beyond it was full. Bodies packed tight enough that individual movement was impossible, only collective surges that rippled through the mass like contractions through muscle. Torches and lanterns threw orange light across faces that ranged from furious to terrified to blank, with the particular numbness that arrives when people have been standing in the cold for hours, fueled by nothing but adrenaline and the shared conviction that something irreversible is happening. Kadric stopped at the top of the steps. The crowd saw him. The noise changed, not louder, sharper, the diffuse roar condensing into something focused, something with a point, the way scattered light becomes dangerous when a lens gathers it into a single beam. He was aware of Thorn behind him, 4 soldiers. Seraphine somewhere further back, inside the building or on the steps. He could not tell because he was not looking backward. He was looking at the crowd, and the crowd was looking at him. And between them was nothing except 30 stone steps, and the distance between a man who had just confessed to an empire and the empire that had to decide what to do with the confession. He descended. 1 step at a time, his boots on the stone were the loudest sound in the plaza because 6,000 people had gone quiet simultaneously. Not the performed silence of a tribunal chamber, the raw, involuntary silence of a crowd watching someone do something they did not expect and not knowing yet whether to respond with violence or something else. Kadric reached the bottom of the steps. The nearest faces were 10 feet away. Men, women, workers in rough clothing stained with the smoke from fires they had set earlier, merchants in better coats, students carrying hand-painted banners, some bearing Alara Vane's name, some bearing slogans he could not read in the torchlight. A woman holding a child against her shoulder with one arm and a stone in her other hand, frozen in the posture of someone who had been ready to throw it and was now reconsidering. He stopped, held the letters against his chest, and spoke. Not the way he spoke in tribunal chambers or grand halls, or the acoustically engineered spaces where his voice had been trained to perform authority. He spoke the way a man speaks when the architecture of performance has been stripped away, and the only thing left is the raw transmission of sound from one human body to others. My name is Kadric Valamon. You know who I am. You know what my family has done. And tonight I am going to tell you what I did. The crowd shifted. A collective lean forward. 6,000 bodies adjusting their center of gravity by fractions of an inch, unconsciously orienting toward the source of information the way organisms orient toward stimulus. 20 years ago, a woman named Alara Vane was executed for treason against House Valamont. The charges were fabricated. The evidence was manufactured. The trial was a performance staged by my father to eliminate a person he could not control. He paused. Let the words settle into the cold air. I knew, not before, not during, but after. I learned the truth, and I buried it because the truth was incompatible with the empire I had inherited, and I spent 20 years governing as if the murder at the foundation of my authority did not exist. A sound moved through the crowd, not words, not a response he could interpret, something more fundamental. The collective exhalation of thousands of people absorbing information that confirms what they already suspected but were never permitted to articulate. Tonight, inside that building, I presented evidence implicating every noble house that participated in my father's governance. Every signature, every authorization, every name. He looked out across the sea of faces. The people who built the system you are standing in front of this building to protest are the same people who convened the tribunal that was supposed to hold me accountable. They were never investigating corruption. They were managing it, ensuring that when the reckoning came, it consumed House Valamont and left everyone else standing. The woman with the stone lowered her arm. Not a decision. An involuntary relaxation of tension, the body releasing a combat posture because the target had stopped behaving like a target. I cannot give you justice, Kadric said. I do not have the authority to undo 20 years of governance built on a lie. I cannot bring back the people my father eliminated. I cannot restore the families that were destroyed. I can only tell you what happened and let you decide what comes next." He held up the letters. 27 pages, cream-colored paper, worn soft by 20 years of being held by hands that should have protected the woman who wrote them and instead stood by while she died. "These are the letters of Elara Vane, written to me, written by a woman who loved this kingdom's heir and was murdered for it. I kept them hidden because they were the only part of my life that was real, and I was afraid that if anyone saw them, I would have to face what their existence meant, that I was not the ruler I pretended to be, that I was a man who had traded the only genuine thing he ever had for an empire that was built on her grave." Silence. Deep. Complete. The kind that has physical presence, that settles over a crowd like snow and muffles everything until the only sound is breathing and heartbeats and the distant crackle of fires that no one was feeding anymore. Then a voice from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. A man. Older. The accent of the merchant quarter. "What do you want us to do?" Kadric looked toward the voice, could not find the face. "I want you to stop burning your own city," he said. "Not for me. For yourselves. The buildings you are destroying belong to you. The streets you are tearing apart are your streets. The empire that failed you cannot be fixed by destroying the infrastructure you depend on to survive." And House Valamon? A different voice. Younger, angrier, female. "House Valamont will answer for what it did, starting with me." The crowd absorbed this, thousands of individual calculations happening simultaneously. Risk assessment. Trust evaluation. The complex, instantaneous social mathematics that occurs when a population confronts a figure of authority who has voluntarily dismantled his own authority and is now standing unprotected in front of them, offering nothing except accountability. Kadric stood in the plaza for 47 minutes. He answered questions, not political questions, not the strategic inquiries that he had spent his career fielding in controlled environments. Raw questions from raw people. A woman who wanted to know whether her brother, imprisoned for distributing pamphlets critical of the Valamont governance 6 years ago, had been charged legitimately or fabricated. A merchant who wanted to know why his taxes had tripled in the past decade, while his representation in the provincial council had been eliminated. A student who asked, with the particular directness of someone too young to have learned diplomatic circumlocution, whether Kadric had ever actually cared about the people he governed, or whether they had always been numbers on a ledger. He answered each one. Some answers were inadequate. Some were honest admissions of ignorance. Some were the kinds of answers that make powerful men uncomfortable because they require acknowledging that the systems they maintain are designed to benefit the maintainers at the expense of the maintained. The crowd did not disperse. But it changed. The kinetic energy that had driven the riots redistributed itself. The rage did not disappear. Rage does not disappear. It transforms. It metabolizes into something else, grief or resolve or exhaustion, or the particular bitter clarity that arrives when people realize that the enemy they came to destroy is standing in front of them bleeding from the same wounds they carry. Thorn extracted him at midnight. The captain had maintained a perimeter of 4 soldiers at the base of the Parliament steps for the entire duration, and when the crowd finally began to thin around the edges, he stepped forward and placed one hand on Kadric's shoulder and said quietly, "That is enough, sir." Kadric did not resist. He walked back up the steps. Through the empty Parliament halls where the debris of the tribunal, overturned chairs, scattered documents, a broken gavel, lay undisturbed because the staff had evacuated hours earlier. Through the eastern corridors to the carriage entrance where a single coach waited with lanterns burning. Seraphine was inside. She had been there for hours, waiting, not because she could not leave, because she chose not to. Kadric climbed in, sat down, the door closed. The carriage moved. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The city passed outside the windows. Smoke-damaged storefronts, broken windows, streets littered with the debris of overturned market stalls and the remains of banners that had been carried for hours, and then abandoned when the arms that held them grew too tired. The aftermath of collective fury. The landscape that remains when thousands of people express simultaneously the accumulated weight of grievances they were never permitted to voice. "You could have been killed," Seraphine said. "Yes." You walked into a crowd of 6,000 people who had spent the evening burning your family's monuments. Yes. And you stood there for almost an hour answering questions from people who had every reason to tear you apart. They did not tear me apart. They could have, but they did not. Seraphine looked at him in the shifting lamplight of the carriage, studied the lines of his face, the exhaustion carved into the skin beneath his eyes, the tension that had lived in his jaw for as long as she had known him, the permanent clench of a man holding something between his teeth that he could neither swallow nor spit out, had loosened, not disappeared, but shifted, reorganized into a different configuration. The face of someone who had been carrying a weight in one position for 20 years and had finally set it down and was now learning what his muscles felt like without it. "What happens now?" she asked. "I do not know." "That is not an acceptable answer from the Duke of Valadorn." "I am not sure I am the Duke of Valadorn anymore." The carriage wheels found a rough patch of cobblestone, and the vehicle shuddered, and the lanterns swung and threw their shadows against the upholstered walls in distorted shapes that looked like neither of them. "You will be," Seraphine said. "The title does not disappear because you confessed. It disappears when the crown formally removes it. And the crown is not going to remove it tonight because the king is hiding in his palace trying to determine whether the riots will spread beyond Arctur. And the last thing he wants is to create a power vacuum in the northern territories by deposing the only ruler who has ever successfully governed them. The king will do what Cassavane tells him to do." Cassavane left the parliament through a service exit 2 hours ago and is currently barricaded inside his estate with a private security detail because 300 protesters are camped outside his gates, carrying copies of the documents you read into the tribunal record. She paused. "I had someone watching. My network has been quite active this evening." Kadric looked at her. For a moment, in the dim interior of a carriage rolling through a damaged city at 1 in the morning, something between them recalibrated. Not dramatically. Not with the thunderclap clarity of revelation. With the slow, quiet adjustment that happens when two people who have spent years maintaining a specific distance realize that the distance was not protecting them. It was preventing them from seeing each other accurately. "You built an intelligence network," he said. "I built it because you did not give me access to yours." "I did not know you wanted access. You did not ask." The accuracy of that statement settled between them. He had not asked. In 11 years of marriage, he had not asked Seraphine what she wanted, because asking would have required treating her as a participant rather than a fixture, as a person with independent strategic capacity, rather than a role he had filled with the most suitable candidate. She had been his Duchess the way his uniform was his uniform, something he wore because the position required it, something he maintained because maintenance was habitual, and underneath that she had been building, quietly, without permission, without recognition, without the resources or institutional support that he took for granted. She had constructed a parallel intelligence apparatus using nothing but social access and the particular kind of patience that develops in people who understand that they will not be given power and therefore must build it themselves, in the margins, in the spaces between what is noticed and what is ignored. "I underestimated you," he said. "Yes. For 11 years. 12. You underestimated me during the courtship as well." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, the precursor to a smile. The muscular preparation for an expression his face had not produced genuinely in so long that the neural pathways required rebuilding. "I am sorry," he said. 2 words. Delivered without performance, without the political calibration that had characterized every statement he had made for the past 2 decades. Just the admission of a man who had finally developed enough self-awareness to recognize the shape of his own failures, and enough courage to name them without flinching. Seraphine received them the way she received everything, with precision, with assessment, and underneath both, with something she had not permitted herself to feel toward Caedric Valamon in all the years she had been his wife. Respect, not the political kind, not the institutional deference that accompanies titles and positions, the personal kind, the respect that one human being develops for another when they witness that person do the hardest possible thing without asking for credit or protection or the guarantee that it would work. "Apologies are not currency," she said. "You cannot spend them. You can only change what caused them." "I know." "Then we start tomorrow." The carriage arrived at Blackthorn Castle at 2 in the morning. The castle was dark. The staff had reduced to essential personnel during the crisis. The corridors were empty and the rooms were cold, and the building had the particular hollowed quality of a structure whose occupants have departed and whose remaining inhabitants are not yet certain whether they are staying. Caedric went to his study. The false panel behind the bookshelf was still open. The cavity where the letters had been stored for 20 years gaped like a wound in the wall. He stood in front of it for a long time. Then he closed it, pushed the bookshelf back into position. The panel clicked shut with a sound like a bone setting. He placed the 27 letters on his desk. Spread them in chronological order. Read the last one. If they ever force you to hate me, remember that I loved you before the Empire ever did. He sat with that sentence for a long time. The fire burned low. The castle settled around him. Snow began falling outside the window, the first snowfall of the season, fat flakes drifting through the darkness with the slow, deliberate motion of things that are not subject to urgency. That fall at their own pace regardless of what is happening beneath them. He did not hate her. He had never hated her. But he had hated the part of himself that loved her, because that part was the evidence of everything his father had failed to eliminate. The proof that beneath the uniform and the title and the calculated expressions and the military posture and the political machinery, there was still a man. Still the 21-year-old who sat on a garden bench after midnight with shaking hands and touched a woman's face and felt for the first time the terrifying weight of being seen by someone who did not want the Duke but wanted the person underneath. His father had tried to kill that person by killing her, and he had nearly succeeded, but nearly is not completely, and the letters had survived, and the love letter had fallen from the chronicle at exactly the wrong moment, which turned out to be exactly the right moment, because the man who picked it up from the marble floor of the Grand Hall of Aurelius 4 days ago was not the same man sitting in this study tonight. That man had been constructed, engineered, assembled from components selected for durability, and stripped of everything that might introduce structural vulnerability. This man was something else. Damaged, exhausted, stripped of title and territory and the certainty that had been the load-bearing wall of his entire architecture, but present, awake, inhabiting his own life for the first time in 20 years rather than operating it from behind a control panel. He picked up a pen, not to write a letter, not to draft a political statement or a military order or any of the documents that had defined his relationship with language for as long as he could remember. He picked it up because the act of holding a pen and preparing to form words on paper was the closest thing he had to a ritual of beginning. And something was beginning. He did not know what it was yet. He did not have a name for it. But it was beginning the way snow begins silently, without announcement, one particle at a time until the accumulation becomes undeniable. He wrote a single line at the bottom of the last letter. I remember. Then he set the pen down. 3 months passed. Blackthorn Castle stood quieter than anyone in Valadorn could remember. The grand balls stopped. The military councils relocated to the provincial garrison under temporary command structures established during the political restructuring. The endless procession of nobles seeking audience, favors, alliances, and the transactional proximity to power that had defined aristocratic life for generations ceased entirely. Not because Caedric refused them, because there was nothing left to seek. The currency of House Valemont, fear, reputation, the implicit threat of consequences for non-compliance, had been spent. All of it. Distributed across a tribunal floor and a public plaza and a burning city in a single night. The political aftermath unfolded the way political aftermaths always do, with less drama and more bureaucracy than the precipitating crisis would suggest. Casavane was formally investigated. The documents Caedric had read into the tribunal record triggered a second inquiry, then a third, each one peeling back another layer of the infrastructure Octavian Valemon had built and the network of complicit aristocrats who had maintained it. Casavane attempted to flee Valadorn 3 weeks after the tribunal. He was arrested at the border. His trial lasted 4 months and ended with the forfeiture of his estates and permanent exile. Hargrove received similar treatment. Tarot negotiated a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony that implicated 6 additional houses. The system ate itself. Not quickly. Not cleanly. with the grinding, bureaucratic thoroughness of institutions that have been forced to acknowledge their own corruption and must now demonstrate accountability, however imperfectly, to a population that is watching. Cedric surrendered half his territories to the crown, not because the king demanded it, because he offered. The northern provinces were redistributed among a newly established council of regional governors, selected through a process that, for the first time in Valadorn's history, included representatives who were not aristocrats. People called him many things afterward: traitor, coward, madman. Some called him honest. He accepted none of them, because titles had stopped meaning anything to him. The duke, the ruler, the heir, the iron-fisted governor of the northern territories. All labels applied by others to describe a function he performed rather than a person he was. And the person he was, the actual person, the one who had been buried beneath 2 decades of performance, was still learning what it meant to exist without the framework. One winter evening, Cedric walked alone through the garden behind Blackthorn Castle. The garden had been neglected for months. The hedges were overgrown. The pathways were covered in fallen leaves that had frozen and thawed, and frozen again until they formed a brittle carpet that cracked under each step. The fountain at the center had stopped working sometime in the autumn, and no one had repaired it because the staff had been reduced and the priorities of the household had shifted from appearance to function. He walked to the bench at the far end of the garden, a stone bench positioned beneath an old oak tree whose branches had been trimmed annually for decades, but had been left to grow wild this year, extending in directions that the gardeners would have corrected, reaching toward light sources that the tree had been prevented from accessing for its entire cultivated life. Cedric sat down. The bench was cold. The air was cold. The sky above Blackthorn was the deep, absolute black of a winter night in the Northern Territories, cloudless, moonless, populated by stars so numerous they blurred into a continuous field of light that made the darkness between them seem less like absence and more like structure. This was the bench, not the same one. The original garden at the old Valamont estate had been demolished when Octavian expanded the family compound 30 years ago. But the position was similar, the angle relative to the main house, the distance from the nearest path, the way the oak tree created a small pocket of enclosure that made the bench feel separate from the rest of the property. Private. Hidden in plain sight. The kind of place where 2 people could sit after midnight and talk about things that would get them killed if the wrong person overheard. He sat there for a long time, not waiting, not thinking in any structured sense, just sitting, allowing his body to occupy a space without requiring the space to serve a strategic purpose, the simple, radical act of being present without performing presence. Footsteps on the frozen leaves. Seraphine appeared at the edge of the garden, wearing a dark coat and no jewelry. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air. She walked to the bench and stood beside it and looked down at him with an expression he had been learning to read over the past 3 months. Not the political mask, not the calculated composure. Something underneath. Something that had always been there and was only now becoming visible because the layers above it had been stripped away by circumstances that neither of them had chosen and both of them had survived. "You're sitting in the cold," she said. "I know. It is 12 degrees. I know that too." She sat down beside him. Not close. Not with the deliberate distance of their previous interactions. Just beside him. 2 people on a bench in a frozen garden in the dark. "The Provincial Council ratified the new governance charter today," she said. 3 dissenting votes, 14 in favor. Your proposal for civilian representation passed without amendment. It is not my proposal. It is the proposal of a committee I contributed to. You wrote every word of it. I contributed language. Seraphine looked at him. The faintest trace of something that might have been amusement moved through her expression. "You are learning modesty," she said. "It is very uncomfortable to watch. It is very uncomfortable to practice." They sat in silence for a while. The garden was still. The castle behind them glowed faintly from the windows of the occupied rooms, a fraction of the illumination that would have been visible a year ago when every floor was staffed and every chandelier was lit, and the building projected power through the simple mathematics of sustained brightness. "The political marriage between us ended 2 months ago," Seraphine said. "The papers were filed. The territorial implications resolved. Our families have been informed. I know. And yet you have not asked me to leave. I did not think it was my place to ask you anything. I have spent 11 years assuming your choices were extensions of my strategy. I am trying to stop doing that. She turned to face him on the bench. The movement was small, but it changed the geometry between them. Two people sitting side by side became two people oriented toward each other. A shift measured in degrees that carried the weight of something neither of them had previously attempted. Conversation without agenda. I am going to stay, she said. Not because of the title. Not because of the alliance. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I am going to stay because I watched you walk into a crowd that wanted to destroy you and tell them the truth. And I have never seen anyone do that. In 32 years of living inside a system that rewards performance and punishes honesty, I have never seen a single person choose the truth when the lie would have been safer. The truth was not brave. It was inevitable. I ran out of the energy required to sustain the lie. That is what courage looks like to people who have been performing strength their entire lives. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like giving up. It looks like the moment when the machinery breaks down and the person underneath is finally visible. She paused. I want to know that person. Kedrick looked at her. In the darkness, with starlight reflecting off the frozen garden, and no audience, and no political framework, and no dynasty requiring them to be anything other than two people who had survived the same catastrophe, he saw her clearly for the first time. Not the Duchess, not the strategist, not the intelligence operative who had built a network in the margins of his inattention, the woman who had watched him destroy everything she had invested in and decided that what remained was more valuable than what had been lost. I do not know who that person is yet, he said. Then we find out. It will not be the life you married into. I did not marry a life, I married a contract. The contract is over. What happens now is something else. What? I do not know, neither do you. That is the point. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence. The accumulation of things felt but not yet articulated. The slow grinding work of a man learning to exist in uncertainty after decades of demanding that every variable be controlled and every outcome be predicted and every human interaction be filtered through the lens of strategic utility. She would have liked you, he said. So quietly, the words almost disappeared into the winter air before they reached her. Seraphine did not ask who, she knew. Tell me about her, she said. And he did, slowly, haltingly. With the particular clumsiness of a man accessing memories he had kept sealed for so long that the retrieval process itself had atrophied. He told her about the debates, the fearlessness, the way Alara would challenge him in public and then find him afterward and ask whether he was angry and seemed genuinely confused when he said no, the midnight meetings, the letters, the handshake of two people who understood that what they were doing could destroy them both and did it anyway because the alternative was living inside a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of connection. He talked for a long time. Seraphine listened, not performing attention, not cataloging information for strategic use. Listening the way human beings listen when someone they care about is finally, after years of silence, trusting them enough to speak. The snow started again sometime past midnight. Light at first, then heavier. Accumulating on the bench and their shoulders and the branches of the oak tree that had grown wild for the first time in its life and looked in the snowfall like something that had finally been allowed to become what it was always supposed to be. Was she worth it? Seraphine asked. The same question. The question everyone wanted answered. The question the Empire had been asking since a piece of cream-colored paper drifted to the floor of the Grand Hall and changed everything. Kedrick looked at the garden, at the frozen fountain, at the castle that still bore his family name but no longer felt like a fortress, at the snow falling through starlight with the slow, patient indifference of things that do not care about empires or legacies or the particular agonies of men who build one at the cost of the other. She was the only thing that ever was, he said. And then he did something he had not done in 20 years. He reached across the bench and took Seraphine's hand. Not as a duke, not as a political partner, not as a man performing the gestures expected by the role he occupied. As a man, broken, rebuilt, learning. Seraphine's fingers closed around his, warm against the cold, present against the absence. The simple, devastating weight of one person choosing to hold on to another in the middle of a frozen garden at the end of an empire. They sat together on the bench while snow covered the ruins of a dynasty that had been built on fear and sustained by silence, and finally, after 3 centuries, brought down by a love letter that refused to stay hidden. The garden was quiet. The castle was still. And somewhere beneath the snow and the starlight and the slow, patient work of a world rebuilding itself one frozen night at a time, the ghost of a woman who had loved a man before the empire ever did finally rested. Not because justice had been served, not because the empire had learned its lesson, because one man, after 20 years of silence, had finally found the courage to say her name out loud and mean it. And that was enough. It was always going to be enough.